Hello, welcome to the video lecture, the third and final video lecture for our Functionalism Week in Philosophy of Mind. And here we'll focus on the article by Thomas Nagel called What is it like to be a bat? So in the Putnam that we read for the previous video, we heard about the empirical reduction, in which we can take any observable phenomena like water, like lightning, and reduce it to a physical description that universally describes what it is. Water is H2O, lightning is electrical discharge. Nagel says, of course, there's a material element to our bodies, and something happens to them when we are in pain. But even if we get the perfect physical description of pain, and it happens to be functionalist, we are a functioning system, we're still missing something. Not everything is explained by this empirical reduction. Pain is a body state such and such, okay? And it's a body state such and such that helps us to function as an organism, okay? But the familiar gap between mind and body remains. And he spends the rest of this article, Nagel does, trying to explain in detail and accurately and precisely what that missing thing is. It's conscious experience, of course. He tells us on page 436 that conscious experience is a widespread phenomena. So what does this mean? When he says conscious experience, he doesn't mean complex language or the ability to sit and abstractly predict or think about things far in the future or in the past. He means anything with any sort of internal life and experience. We have a complicated internal life. We have this formal abstract language that other animals don't possess. There are lots of animals that do have a form of language, but not quite as complex or abstract as we do. We have goals, again, that we can plan for far, far in the future, or we can think about to our personal distant past. But what about other animals? Nagel says it's obvious that many of them have some form of internal experience, even if it's many shades less complicated than the ones human beings possess. And he says that this definition of conscious experience can be called the subjective character of experience, or the what it's like to be any particular organism or individual. There's a what it's like to be human, but there's also a what it's like to be you, your particular self. There's also presumably what it's like to be a gorilla or a chimpanzee or a dog or a cat or a rabbit. And this what it's like is the central issue for the apparent divide between mind and body. And we've previously, in the introductory chapter in the online textbook to functionalism, have called this Qualia or Qualia. Nagel tells us that when we study the empirical world and we use scientific reasoning, we are often trying to move from a subjective description of something out in the world to an objective description. So our subjective description of water is that it's clear, it can be cold or hot, it can be frozen, it can evaporate into steam. There's a particular satisfaction to drinking it when we're very thirsty. Temperature can feel hot or cold. These are all subjective descriptions of any particular object or experience. And when we scientifically describe something, we move toward the objective, a statement or set of statements or theory that's universal to all subjects that can comprehend it. So temperature being the mean molecular energy is one of these kinds of objective scientific descriptions. Every single person in a materialistic universe has access to objective explanations of something. So if a Martian came down or we created artificial intelligence, it would have access to understanding water or lightning in this way. And any mind could objectively understand pain in this way as well, as maybe the firing of certain nerve fibers in an animal body, or on a functionalist definition, the subclass of behaviors and states that a being disvalues, like we saw in the last video. Yet it still doesn't capture the qualia or the what it's like to feel pain. And how do we describe that to an AI, to a theoretical Martian, to data from Star Trek? Any physicalistic or materialistic view of mind and brain, saying that brain and mind are all physical, not immaterial, has to account for these subjective experiences or these qualia. One way to prove this is to think about the philosophical zombie. We can imagine a human being that has all the prerequisite bodily states. They have a body just like ours. They have a brain just like ours. All of the chemicals are functioning and coursing through the body in a functional system, but all internal experience is just zapped out. They're a zombie. They have no inner life whatsoever, but they behave as if they do. And this philosophical zombie has no what it's like. No qualia, no qualia, no tasting of strawberries, no redness of the red, but we'll never be able to detect it because we don't have access to other creatures' internal experiences. And he notes down at the bottom, Nagel does, that perhaps once we get to the complexity of the human brain, this isn't even possible. Once you get that complex, you just automatically have internal experience. But that's fine for Nagel's thought experiment here, because it's also conceivable that they do not, that they're just a blank slate inside, even when they have all of the physical components of being a human being. So then he tells us it's useless to base the defense of materialism on any analysis of mental phenomena that fails to deal explicitly with their subjective character. If we want to be materialists or physicalists and say that the mind is completely physical, we must account in our theories for the what it's like, the subjective character of experience. What about the subjective character of experience for non-human animals? He chooses a bat for several reasons. It's a mammal, so there is some overlap between the bodily systems of us as human beings and the bodily systems of them as bats. We're in some categories, we're in some of the same categories as animals, yet they are radically different to us. Many times, scientists have described vision as dominating our senses as human beings compared to taste, touch, and smell. We rely on vision a lot more to navigate our lives and to internalize our thoughts when we're abstract, when we're doing abstract thinking. Whereas bats instead have the same disproportionate emphasis on their audio equipment. They rely for navigation in the world on sonar. It's a myth that they're blind. They do have some sight, but their hearing is so much sharper and utilized than it is for us that they might shriek or even just use the ambient noise around them to know what the shape of the space that they're in is. So whereas we look around and we say we're in a room with walls or we're outside, they listen for the echoes, and that's how they build up the picture of where they are in the environment. And there's something it's like to be a bat. There's something to what it means to have This sonar subjective experience, but we have no access to it whatsoever. And we can't even think of a way that we might possibly have access to it. Of course, you might respond immediately that we can imagine what it's like. We can close our eyes and think about using sonar to navigate out in the world. There are even some blind people that have developed a kind of clicking sonar to try and help them navigate out in the world. But we're always imagining from a human perspective. We have all the hardware in our brains and bodies that is what it is to be human. And when we imagine, when we try to add sonar to our repertoire of sensory organs, or we try to take away our vision, we're still doing it from the conceptual perspective of humanity. And we can never actually get to the point where it's just pure bad experience. These experiential things, these what it's like, Nagel calls subjective facts. And in a materialistic description of a world where we don't have any sort of immaterial, spooky things about mind, all facts should be accessible to everyone. We should at least theoretically be able to understand in an objective way every single phenomenon that happens in time and space. Nothing should be purely private to one particular perspective. Yet we know that internal experience isn't like this. It is private, and it is possibly never experienceable by another type of creature. There's some sort of translation we could do. We could explain what redness is like to another creature, what redness is like for us as humans to another creature. But they'll never get it because they aren't human beings. Now, we can think about this in terms of other animals as well. There's a type of shrimp that has more rods and cones than we do and can see vastly more higher number of colors than we can. And if that shrimp became intelligent and tried to explain it to us, they can say, well, it's such and such a wavelength is this new color that I'm trying to explain to you. But we'd never know what it looks like because we don't have those rods and cones. Some sharks can sense electricity. Some bugs only sense or predominantly sense in the UV spectrum. There's another one. And some animals can sense in the infrared spectrum of wavelengths. And we'll never know. We can study the scientific description of it all we want, but we'll never know what it's like to experience it in a particular way using a particular sense organ. And Nagel says he's a realist about this subjective domain. The what it's like of experiencing a certain thing as a certain creature is a real fact about the world. It's either true or false that you can experience it well, that's it, period. It's either true or false that you can experience it. And this puts materialism into a bit of trouble. Because how can it count as material if we can't describe it in a material way? So if this is true, then that means the structure of your body, including your brain, can limit our understanding of the universe and other creatures and our place in it. We have limits to our understanding. And the limits of the objective, he says here, page 442, this bears directly on the mind-body problem. For if the facts of experience, facts about what it's like for the experiencing organism, are accessible only from one point of view, then it is a mystery how the true character of experiences could be revealed in the physical operation of that organism. So we're trying to look for a physical description of what red looks like if we want to be successful materialists. How could we possibly do that? Bringing it closer to home, he says, let's think about trying to explain the redness of red to a person who has been blind from birth. How could we even do that? It doesn't even seem like there's a possibility of doing that. We can describe cellular makeup. We can use metaphors. In our article, it was red is like a trumpet blast. We can get all of the networks of neurons. We can get all the neurotransmitters and the chemical things that happen to us when we see red, but we can't describe the essence of redness or the internal experience of it. Now, Nagel says that this doesn't mean physicalism is wrong or materialism is wrong. Saying something is currently non-understandable doesn't mean that it's understandable for all eternity or that it's impossible to understand. And that's a classic logical error. It's an argument from ignorance. Because we don't know something, it's impossible. And that's not true. We just don't know how yet. And in the very end of the article, Nagel tries to give light at the end of the tunnel or a possible path to try and make a start on rescuing physicalism. He says, we already have evidence that simple sensations are physical. So if you press your finger down on a hard surface on your desk or your computer, we can map the pressure as an impulse going up to your brain and coming back down. And that's a lot more understandable through a physical description than something like an intentional mental state. And we'll spend a lot of time on intentionality later on in the semester. But for now, all we need to worry about is that an intentional mental state we need to explain how it causes behavior. When you have an intention, you are aiming at something in the world. If you're thirsty, you have an intention to go get water. And having an intention and a goal in your brain, in your mind, from a subjective point of view is a lot harder to describe in physical terms than a simple sensation. As part of his conclusions here, I have a long quote from page 449. He says, and this is part of his trying to rescue materialism or physicalism, I should like to close with a speculative proposal. It may be possible to approach the gap between subjective and objective from another direction, setting aside temporarily the relation between the mind and the brain. We can pursue a more objective understanding of the mental in its own right. At present, we are completely unequipped to think about the subjective character of experience without relying on the imagination. So what does he mean here? I can imagine myself in some other human being's place. I can close my eyes and think, well, what if all of the things about them were now about me? They told me that they were in pain physically. They told me they were sad. They told me that they had this particular desire. And I can imagine myself being in those situations. When I try to imagine myself as a bat or a cat or an alien, I'm less equipped to really get what their experience would be, but I can imagine it. I can imagine being blind from birth. He's saying that we need to try and develop a language of describing internal experience without using your imagination like that, without taking up the point of view of the experiential subject. This should be regarded as a challenge to form new concepts and devise a new method, an objective phenomenology not dependent on empathy or the imagination. Though presumably it would not capture everything, its goal would be to describe, at least in part, the subjective character of experiences in a form comprehensible to beings incapable of having those experiences. So what he's calling for is a first step to a physical description of subjective experiences. If we could sit down with a person who was blind from birth and not tell them to imagine anything, or vice versa, not imagine what it's like to be blind from our perspective. If we could develop a vocabulary and a set of concepts and theories about the redness of red or the blueness of blue and explain that to a blind person, then we would be on the road toward a physical description of personal internal experiences. Throughout the semester, we are going to look at various types of theories that attempt to explain qualia or explain why qualia doesn't matter to a physicalist description. Some of them will include that internal experiences are only a perspective on physical facts and not a fact in and of itself. Some of them will try and look at the evolutionary history of all animals to see how internal experience developed in the first place. But first, next week, we're going to look at a set of theories known as property dualism. So when we talked about Descartes' substance dualism, we said that mind was an entirely different substance to physical matter. Now we're going to look at the properties of things. So when you look at an apple, it has the properties of being red, it has the properties of being round-ish, it has the property of being edible, having a certain density and feel, etc., etc., etc. So we can be dualistic about objects and their properties without being dualistic by saying that anything exists over and above the physical universe. As always, please ask questions either through email or comments or come to office hours. That's the end of our functionalism week. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next set of videos.